You're listening to the Otis Jiry channel.
Part 8. Before I go any further, I do have to apologize for the length of this particular installment. You see, I've been putting off this part of the story for a while, and now that I've gotten to it, I felt I just couldn't let myself break it up any further, or I'd never bring myself to finish it. Hope you all understand. Now, to finish my story. As I've alluded so far, I grew up very well-to-do. The complaints of my relatives about draftiness in my old childhood room notwithstanding, the fact is that today, barely anyone short of a movie star or financial CEO would be able to afford the house itself, even on less expansive property than its manor-esque grounds. I don't bring this up to brag, but rather to drive home that, even to someone as used to affluence as I was, Barnett Reynolds' compound was stunning enough to make me audibly gasp from the back seat of the sleek, chauffeured black Bentley that had met me at the airport when I arrived for my meeting with Mr. Reynolds. What was more, after getting over my shock at the sheer size of the house, which looked more like someone had built several castles side by side than like a simple home, it struck me immediately why Barnett Reynolds had become so famous as an architect. In fact, I was even able to notice a few of the similarities between my childhood home and the palatial colossus. I'm not an expert on architecture, so detailing the finer points of Reynolds' art is a bit beyond me. However, what I will say is that due to some very counterintuitive structural elements and manipulation of light, Reynolds was able to transform what should, in both cases, have seemed imposing and austere Gothic monstrosities into seeming nothing less than homey. In the case of Reynolds' own home, this was particularly impressive given its size and the fact that it seemed to be made up almost entirely of spires and sharp edges and possessed very few windows. However, due to the color of the stone Reynolds used, to say nothing of the soft lights he used to illuminate the miles-long driveway and the house itself, I simply couldn't avoid feeling like I was approaching something out of a fairy tale. As soon as the Bentley stopped, my door was opened by an absurdly stick-necked valet, who guided me through the main doors of Reynolds' Titanic house. Unfortunately, passing out of sight of the house's towering exterior did little to dispel my wonder, as the interior was, if anything, even more magnificent. I won't belabor you with details, except to say that if you were to imagine every feature a house could have that would make its owner feel entirely at ease while also utterly empowered, you should probably imagine something half as grand as what Barnett Reynolds had so meticulously constructed for himself. Indeed, once I stopped gawking at the surroundings and let my brain process what I was seeing, I found that I could get something of an impression of Reynolds himself. This was clearly a house designed by a man with a powerful need to remind his guests, and most likely himself, of what sort of opulence and genius it would take to create it. In fact, thinking back on Reynolds' past as a bullied, emotionally fragile orphan, I felt I immediately understood why Reynolds built his homes both so large and so hospitable. This was less a house than a glittering, perfect, and fiercely fortified womb designed to keep all unpleasantness at the greatest remove possible. Small wonder, then, that Reynolds' secretaries were themselves so fierce about screening his would-be visitors. I must have said something very important to be permitted entry. The valet, leading me, pulled up sharply before a pair of warm cherrywood double doors, which he thrust open. "The Redcliffe study," he said by way of explanation. "Mr. Reynolds will be down to meet you shortly. Please wait here." Then he ushered me in and shut the doors behind me. I turned around, expecting to see a room furnished much like the rest of the house, and found myself catching my breath for the third time in surprise. The fact that this room, of all the others, was called the Ratcliffe Study should have been a tip-off to what it really was. A holding tank for people Barnett Reynolds would have preferred to keep out of his sanctuary. Like the rest of the house, the room was well furnished and sumptuously laid out, with walls done in shining oxblood paint that reflected light prettily from a roaring fireplace. Nevertheless, even if you were a complete architectural neophyte, the angles at which the walls met the ceiling would have struck you as odd at the very least, and the paint on the walls would have seemed just a little too reflective and a little too dark. It was like walking into a very large, misshapen cell that had been painted in blood. Even the obviously expansive black leather armchairs seemed more like voids sucking color from the room than like anything comfortable. Despite the room being a very comfortable temperature, I admit I involuntarily shuddered when sitting down. Even as the leather cradled my slight form, it still felt as if the room's decor was screaming at me to leave. Trying to distract myself, I started busying myself with the tea tray that had been set in the midst of the chairs. I was halfway through smearing some clotted cream on a scone when the door to the study boomed open, and a quavery tenor voice sounded angrily from it. "What do you want?" Barnett Reynolds stood framed in the doorway. Even with the years of aging, fine clothes, and immaculately coiffed gray hair and mustache, he was unmistakable as the same suspicious-eyed boy who I'd seen in Cloverwell's old photos. But where the suspicion in that photo had been dulled by the age of the photograph, in person it was like staring into a laser beam of hostility. Even so, despite his greater age and obvious power over the situation, even I couldn't help noticing the extent to which Reynolds' hostility couldn't mask his own vulnerability. It was like watching a rabbit play at being a tiger, and it made me feel at once sorry for whatever I had done to upset him. Putting on my most comforting smile, I stood up. "Mr. Reynolds, hi, my name is Emma Sutton," I said. "It's such a pleasure." "What do you want?" Reynolds bit off the end of every word, his sound, his voice, more like a poorly tuned trumpet, the higher it rose. I started again. "As I told your secretary—" "I'm not an idiot, Miss Sutton." That nasal squeak was almost desperate with rage now. "And I don't think you're an idiot either. You've harassed my home with questions about the most painful time in my life, first with vague insinuations about Barney, and then by actually naming the creature himself. You know something, and I would wager you want something. You're a pest, Miss Sutton, and since I can't get rid of you by ignoring you, and don't want the trouble of bringing down the police, I want to know just what it is that you want, and that will make you go away." The spluttering, half-panicked delivery of this rant was all that made me capable of not feeling overly frightened myself. I could sense that, however much he wanted to intimidate me, the truth was that he was far more frightened of me, a slight college-aged girl, than I was of him. The man was a nervous wreck, and I could see how he'd been such an easy target for a bully as a child. Putting as much calm and soothing kindness into my voice as I could, I replied to him frankly. "Mr. Reynolds, I promise you, I don't want to hurt you or take anything from you." "Then why are you here?" the man erupted. "What do you think you know?" I actually am more curious about what you know, Mr. Reynolds," I said. The reply seemed to shock him into silence just long enough that I pressed on. "I'm not here because I want to threaten your safety. I promise. I'm here because I need information about Barnaby Ratcliffe. For my safety." His eyes widened, and he stared at me even harder, this time with more bewilderment than hostility. "Who are you?" he asked. "And what's your safety got to do with it?" Barney Ratcliffe can't hurt you, and I've never heard of you before now. Are you some sort of long-lost family of his?" "No, not family," I said. "As to how my safety's involved, I don't think you'd believe me if I told you. But trust me that nothing we say to each other here matters to me beyond assuring my safety. I am not here to blackmail you or to hurt you or try me." I blinked. Excuse me?" "You say you wouldn't believe I wouldn't believe you if you told me why Barnaby's involved with your safety," said Reynolds, still sounding agitated, though no longer nearly as frantic or as angry as he had just a moment ago. "Try me. You're already a strange young woman who I've never heard of, badgering me about something I would rather forget, and swearing it's not for your nefarious purposes. Matters can't possibly be more confusing than that. Try me." I hesitated for a moment, and he gave an exasperated noise. "At this rate, even if you are insane, I'd sooner find out and then tell you whatever will quiet your delusion and make you leave me alone." I sighed. "All right," I said. "If that's the way you feel, then I'll say it. I used to meet Barney Ratcliffe in my dreams every night as a girl. I think he and I shared dreams, and I think—" "What sort of dreams?" asked Reynolds, his eyebrows raised sharply. I was taken aback. This wasn't at all the question I'd expected. Nevertheless, I answered him. "Nightmares," I said. "Horrible, grisly, awful nightmares that I still can't get out of my head. And in those nightmares I always saw a little boy named Barney getting hurt by something I can barely stand to think about. At first I thought he might be you because the house I grew up in is one that you used to own. That's why I called asking about Barney." Reynolds' entire aspect changed. In an instant, he marched through the door to the chair opposite me and perched himself on it like a bird. He was no longer looking at me with hostility, but instead with an uneasy mixture of genuine human concern and all-encompassing dread. "Which house was it?" he asked me in a low voice. "If you don't want me to believe you are insane, then it is very important that you tell me. Which house?" I gazed steadily into his eyes. "I think you know which one," I said softly. "The one you built for yourself in the 40s, the one you rebuilt from the skeleton of the Crunchley Parish Charity School. And I think you know which room I had, because I think it's the same one Barnaby Ratcliffe had when you lived there." The color had drained completely from Barnett Reynolds' face, as had the anger and mistrust. He now regarded me with that same sense of dread, but this time there was real pity, even compassion, in his gaze. He reached out and awkwardly patted me on the arm. "I apologize, Miss Sutton," he said. "When I was more well-established in fame and wealth, many people once tried to come after me for money, claiming they know something about Crunchley Parish. I paid them all to go away, and I assumed you were one of the same. But your predicament—" He shuddered. "Miss Sutton, I will tell you all you need to know, but first you must tell me 2 more things. First, for the love of God, please tell me you no longer sleep alone in that house, and certainly not alone in that room." I nodded. "I've shared a room with my sister since I worked out that made the dreams stop. I haven't slept in my old room since." "Good. Oh, very good." He exhaled with a palpable relief. "And when you did sleep in that room, did you ever bring anything in that you kept by your bed? Anything at all? A stuffed animal, perhaps, or—" "A dream journal," I said. "My parents bought it for me, and it was what helped me figure out that living in the room might help my nightmares. But you haven't written in it since." "No." Reynolds exhaled and sat back in his chair. "Thank God," he said. "In that case, Miss Sutton, your greatest danger is already past, I believe. And make no mistake, I do not think you are insane. In fact, I believe you, perhaps alone among mankind, will understand why I have been entirely unable to forget that part of my life. Ask your questions. I will tell you truthfully, more truthfully than I have told a living soul since." I smiled at him and squeezed his arm. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds," I said. "To begin with, why did you bother to move the Crenchley Parish Charity School to the States if your memories of it are so terrible?" Reynolds shrugged. "An odd decision, I admit," he said with a wry chuckle. "I suppose that since my unprecedented success as an architect and owner of other people's homes, I thought I might get some sort of spiritual closure if I took the place I most despised as a home and remade it in my image. And I suppose it worked after a fashion, but it wasn't enough to lay the memories to rest completely. I don't think it ever will be." I nodded. "So what memories were you hoping to lay to rest? Besides the fact that you were bullied so horribly, I mean." "Bullied?" Reynolds gave a piercing, hollow, bitter laugh that lasted almost a minute. "Bullied? Oh, Miss Sutton, I was worse than bullied. I was tormented and terrorized ceaselessly, from morning till night. The word bullied is wholly inadequate to describe it. But please don't mistake me. I should find no words to thank God if I were to waken tomorrow and discover that those were the only memories I had to avoid. No, the memories I seek to escape are not memories of the guilt of others, Miss Sutton. They are memories of my own guilt." I felt myself holding my breath as he spoke his last sentence, and as a result my next question was almost croaked rather than spoken. "Did you push Barnaby Radcliffe down the stairs?" Reynolds' expression sank as despair seemed to overcome every one of his features. "Did I push him? Myself?" "No," he said mournfully, "but I may as well have, Miss Sutton. I may as well have. And I think only you can understand fully why I say that." I nodded attentively to signal my absolute interest. Reynolds gave an almost convulsive sigh and began to speak in a voice filled with infinite sadness. "Barnaby Radcliffe bullied me relentlessly, Miss Sutton. Treated me worse than a dog, almost killed me once or twice, given how much he seemed to enjoy holding my head under water and hearing me gasp and splutter for mercy. But I forgave him, Miss Sutton. I forgave him all of it. For as implacable as he was to me, I now have every reason to believe he was tortured twice as terribly, and was seeking the only means of asserting control left to him." Reynolds' hands shook, and he pulled a hip flask from his pocket, which he sucked on greedily before continuing. "The other children called Barnaby by a nickname, Barmy Barnaby. They called him that because of his violent fits every night, and because he was so vicious as a bully that we all found it more comforting to think this cruelty was just a byproduct of mental illness. Oh, if only we or someone else had been discerning enough to see the truth. Barnaby wasn't mad, Miss Reynolds. He was as sane as you are, and he was as much a victim of something I don't believe I'll ever understand, and which I sorely wish I had never had the misfortune to encounter." Another swig followed this. As Reynolds went on speaking, I noticed that his voice sounded progressively less and less refined, and as the Cockney accent from his youth flared up. "I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. As you might guess, Miss Sutton, the orphanage staff were pretty desperate to find a way to get rid of Barney's nighttime visitations. Trouble was, psychology was a bit of a joke subject to at the time, even more so than it is now. I mean, so what Lyle they did try would sound absurdly quaint in retrospect. I'll spare most of it, but what you need to know is that one of their half-arsed ideas was to buy Barnaby a teddy. Can you believe that? They got a boy what's waking the dead with his screaming, and the solution is to buy him a bloody teddy bear. Worthless, the lot of them. More whiskey went down the hatch, and Reynolds' cultured speech degenerated even further. Thing is, Barney actually bloody liked that stupid bear. Didn't let most of us see him carrying it around, but, oh, if anyone so much as touched it, there'd be devil to pay. Now, I wasn't much for courage, but one day after Barney got finished beating me with an inch of my life, I got it into me head to sneak into his room and piss on the bloody thing. Serve him right, I thought, and it might be the only bit of revenge I'd have the guts for. There was barely a trace of Reynolds' old speaking style as he downed the remnants of his flask and rose to refill it from one of the many crystal decanters in the room. He held out a glass to me, but I declined. I wanted to be sober for whatever this was going. Eventually, he sat back down and began speaking again. Bloody hell, I need a lot more nosh before this is over. And took a swig. Anyway, back to me pissing on Barney's damn bear. Funny thing is, coward though I was, I actually got up the nerve to go through with it. Snuck right in to his room one day while he was out shoving the girls' faces into dog shit, or whatever his sick pleasure was that day. Even brought a canteen of water, what I'd filched from one of the nurses, and drank half of it before taking the damn near bear, setting it against the wall and pulling down the zipper to do me business. I would have done it, too, only right then I heard Barney's voice so close it almost made me jump out of my skin. I said I wouldn't do it if I was you, Nettles. His drag on the flask this time was so long, I half thought he might be trying to drown himself with it. But eventually he wiped his face indelicately with his sleeve and continued. So, of course, I looked sharp right quick, looked round to see where Barney was, only he was nowhere in the room. Thought I was hearing things at first, but then I heard his voice again. Down here, maggot, it said. So I looked down, and he took another long drink, and when he stopped, he fixed his eyes on me with the most terrified, fleeting look I'd ever seen from another human being. I haven't told anyone else this, Miss Sutton, he half whimpered. They'd think I was mad and chuck me in an asylum. But you won't, will you? No, you won't. 'Cause you know there's something what's off about this whole business. You got to know that. Otherwise you wouldn't be here. You... I put my hand on his arm gently and squeezed it in what I hoped was an appropriately motherly way. It's okay, Mr. Reynolds, I said. I'll believe you. Just tell me what happened. Tears started to stream from his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice came out in a childlike shriek several octaves too high for a man his age. It was the fucking bear, Miss Sutton. The fucking bear was looking up at me and fucking grinning at me like I was a fresh-cooked bloody turkey. Somehow its stitching had got loose and its mouth was grinning and looking like it was full of something worse than stuffing. Like it had teeth, Miss Sutton. Fucking bloody grinning teeth.